My stepfather handed me an economy ticket and said, business class is for real family, then begged me to introduce him to my grandmother as the head. So I introduced him as exactly what he was. I'm 24. My mom married Roland 6 years ago, and they have 2 kids, Ben who's 5 and Cora who's 3, and I love those two more than anything in the world. Roland and I never got along, and we both knew the reason. My real dad died when I was 12, and I never once called Roland dad. He took it as a personal insult, like I was keeping a chair empty just to spite him. The trip was for my grandmother Greta's 70th birthday, in the country my dad grew up in. She is my dad's mother, my blood, the only piece of him I can still hug. Roland insisted on paying for the flights himself because, his words, that's what the man of a family does. At the airport, he handed out tickets. Business class for him, for my mom, for Ben, for Cora. Then he held a thinner envelope out to me. Economy. Business is for real family. He said it in front of the gate agent, in front of everyone. Ben grabbed my hand and asked if he could sit with me, and Cora started crying because she wanted to too. Roland told them no, that they were sitting up front where they belong. My mom looked at her shoes and said, just this once, please don't make it a thing. I said okay. Then Roland put his arm around me, suddenly warm, and asked me a favor. Your grandmother has never met me. When we land, I want you to introduce me as their father, as the head of this family. Make it look right in front of her people. Can you do that? I told him sure. He walked off to the lounge while I sat at the gate alone. The flight was long. I sat in the back. They sat up front. When we landed, he had me carry the kids' bags through the airport while he and my mom walked ahead with nothing in their hands. My Aunt Faye, my dad's sister, was waiting, and she hugged me so long that Roland cleared his throat. At a gas stop, she pulled me aside and told me what had been going on. Roland had been emailing Greta for months, calling himself the children's father in those emails, asking about the old family house, hinting it should pass to the children now that my dad was gone, meaning his two. He'd told my mom that once Greta met him, she'd adore him, and that I'd finally have to call him dad or look like the bitter one. Faye said Greta had read every email and said nothing, just waited. Somewhere on that drive, I stopped being angry. I just stopped caring whether Roland liked me, and I decided to give him the exact trip he had given me. Greta throws a welcome dinner the first night, and she seats people closest to her by how close they are to her heart. I carried Roland's bag into the house. I smiled at him. I poured his drink. That night, the long table filled up. Greta put me at her right hand. She put Ben and Cora next to me, because the second they saw me, they climbed into the chairs beside mine and would not move. My mom sat near Greta, and Roland, when he came in expecting the head of the table, found the only open chair was at the very far end, down with the neighbors and the second cousins he had never met. He sat down slowly. When the food was served, Greta asked me to introduce everyone to her side, since they only knew me. I stood up. This is my mom, Helen. These two are Ben and Cora. And this, I said, nodding all the way down to the far end, is Roland, my mom's husband. Not their father, not the head of anything. Greta nodded politely down the table and thanked Roland for bringing the little ones all this way to visit, the way you thank a guest. Roland's face went tight. He found me by the dessert table later and grabbed my arm. What was that? You promised you'd introduce me as their father. You made me look like a stranger in there. I kept my voice level. I introduced you as what you are. You told me at the airport that business class is for real family. That table in there is the family table. I figured you'd want to know how the back of the plane feels. He started to get loud. He said I had turned my own grandmother against him, that I was poisoning his kids, that this was sick and everyone could see it. I let him talk. Then little Ben wandered over, tugged Greta's sleeve, and asked the most honest question in the world. Grandma, why is Roland sitting so far away? Did he do something bad? The whole room just stopped. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Conversations cut off mid-word. Greta didn't rush. She lowered herself down slowly, her knees cracking, and took Ben's face in both her hands the way she used to take mine when I was small. She looked right at him and said, no, sweetheart, he is sitting exactly where he fits. She said it soft, like it was only for Ben, but the room was so quiet that every single person heard it. I looked down the table at Roland. His jaw went tight, and his fingers squeezed his napkin until his knuckles turned white, but he didn't say a word. He couldn't. Everyone was watching him, and Roland was smart enough to know that making a scene on Greta's own turf would be the end of whatever ground he thought he still had. So he sat there, picked up his water glass, took a slow sip, and pretended nothing had happened. But I could see it in his eyes. He was already planning his next move. When the plates were cleared, I saw Roland steer Helen toward the hallway. The walls in Greta's house are old and thin, and the hallway is right off the dining room. I was helping Faye stack dishes when I heard his voice come through the door, that tight, controlled tone he uses when every word is a weapon. Your son just destroyed 6 years of work in one sentence, he said. 6 years, Helen. You need to fix this, or we are leaving tomorrow. Then Helen's voice, small, almost a whisper. The kids are happy. Can we just get through the weekend? Roland didn't let her finish. Happy? They are clinging to him like I do not exist. That is not happiness. That is brainwashing. I set the plates down and walked out the back door onto the porch for air. The night was warm, and the garden smelled like the jasmine Greta had been growing since before I was born. Faye was already out there with a cigarette. Your grandmother printed every email he ever sent her, she said. I told her I knew he'd been emailing. She shook her head. You don't know the half of it. In one, he called you the boy. Said you have no real claim to anything on the Dyer side. Said the house should go to, direct quote, the biological children of the current marriage. I felt something go still inside me. Not angry, not yet. Just still, like the moment before a storm, when even the wind holds its breath. Your father built half the walls in that house with his own hands, Faye said, and her voice cracked. He was 17 when he helped your grandfather put up the second floor. He carved his initials into the beam over the pantry door. Did you know that? I did know. I used to stand on a chair and trace the letters with my finger when I was little. Roland wants to erase him, Faye said. He wants to walk into a house your father bled for and put his own name on it and hand it to children who have never set foot here before this week. I sat there with my head down and felt every bit of it. I was ready to burn it all down at breakfast. Then the back door opened and Helen came out. She sat down next to me, close enough that her shoulder touched mine. For a long time, she just sat there wiping her nose with the back of her wrist. Then she said, I read those emails too. Faye showed me on the drive from the airport. Her voice broke in the middle. He told me he was just writing to introduce himself, getting to know your grandmother before we arrive. He never told me about the house. I'd spent 6 years thinking my mom chose Roland over me every time, but right now she wasn't looking away. She put her cold hand on top of mine. I am not asking you to forgive him, she said. I am asking you to let your grandmother handle this her way. But she wasn't defending Roland. For the first time in 6 years, she was just asking me to trust Greta, the one person in this family I had never once doubted. So I made a choice. I chose to wait. But I looked at Helen and said, if he goes after Grandma's house tomorrow, I will not be quiet. She nodded. She didn't argue. She didn't say, please don't make it a thing. The next morning, I woke to pots clanking and the smell of coffee. Greta was already at the stove, her back straight, her hair pinned up, looking like she'd been awake for hours. I was pouring myself a cup when Roland walked in carrying a bouquet of expensive flowers. He was dressed nice, clean shirt, hair combed back, wearing the smile he uses when he wants something. He walked right up to Greta and held the flowers out like he was presenting a gift to a queen. I know we have only spoken through emails, he said, warm as I'd ever heard him. But I want you to know how much your son's memory means to me. I am raising his boy as my own. He meant me. He was standing in my dead father's mother's home calling me his boy like he had earned that. Greta looked at the flowers. She looked at Roland. Thank you, Roland. These are lovely. Then she set them by the stove and turned back to her pots like he'd handed her a grocery bag and gave him nothing at all. Roland filled in the blanks himself the way he always does and decided the silence meant acceptance. He walked out smiling like he had just closed a deal, and I stood there thinking, you have no idea what is coming. Out back, Faye and I dragged the long wooden tables across the grass and lined the chairs up. Greta had strung lights between the trees and there were flowers everywhere, real ones from the garden, not store-bought like Roland's. We were lining up the last row when Greta came out, walked past Faye to me, and stopped. She reached up and took my face in both her hands, the same way she had with Ben the night before, the same way she used to when I was 7. Her palms were warm. She looked me in the eyes and said, your father would be proud of who you are. Do not let anyone tell you that you do not belong here. My throat got tight. Then she got very still and very serious and said, tonight I will read something at dinner. When I do, I need you to stay calm. Can you do that for me? I didn't know what she was planning, but I knew Greta, so I said yes. She patted my cheek twice, soft, and walked back inside. All afternoon, Roland put on the performance of his life. He carried chairs from the garage. He chatted with relatives as they showed up early to help. He scooped Cora onto his hip and carried her around for an hour, making sure every person saw him being a father. And he was good at it. He shook hands with my dad's cousins and laughed at jokes he probably didn't understand. But the smiles he got back were thin. Nobody pulled him into a real conversation the way they did with me. He was getting the economy version of their warmth, and he didn't even notice. Your grandmother called every one of them last week, Faye told me quietly. She read them the part about you having no claim. She did not ask anyone to be rude. She just told them the facts and let them decide. Later, Helen found me, eyes red, and pulled me into the little room where Greta keeps her sewing machine. Roland told me this morning that if Greta does not acknowledge him tonight, he is filing for full custody of Ben and Cora and moving back home without me. Everything in me went tight, my chest, my hands, my jaw. He said it in front of Ben, she whispered, and her voice broke. Ben heard the whole thing. He was threatening to take those kids from their mother, using Ben and Cora like chips to make everyone fold, and he had said it in front of a 5-year-old. I found Ben on the front porch steps, knees pulled to his chest, looking so small. I sat down beside him. He didn't look up. Then in this quiet little voice, like he was scared of the answer, he said, are you and me still brothers? It hit me so hard I had to take a breath before I could answer. I put my arm around him and pulled him close. Always, I said, no matter what. He leaned into me, and I could feel his little heart going too fast for a kid sitting still. He just knew his dad had said something bad, and the one person he trusted to make it right was the one his father had put in the back of the plane. I'd promised Greta I would stay calm, and I would. But calm didn't mean silent, not anymore. By dinner, there were 50 people along the long table, the lights glowing against the darkening sky. I was at Greta's right again, Ben and Cora beside me, Helen a few seats down, Roland in the middle between two cousins who barely noticed him. For about 5 minutes, it felt like a real birthday dinner. Then Roland stood up. He didn't wait for Greta to welcome anyone. He picked up his glass and clinked it with his fork, and the sound cut through every conversation like a bell. He smiled the smile he practiced in the mirror and said, forgive me for speaking up, but I could not let this moment pass. I may not be blood, but I have dedicated my life to continuing your son's legacy through his children. He looked at Ben. He looked at Cora. He never once looked at me. He said his children, like my father's legacy, started and ended with the kids Roland had made. Several of my dad's relatives glanced at me. I kept my face still. Greta sat with her hands folded and gave him nothing. Just that patient look, like she's reading the last page of a book she already knows the ending to. People clapped, polite, short. Roland sat down looking like he'd won something and leaned over to Helen, just loud enough for me to hear 3 seats away. See? They love me. This is how it should have gone from the beginning. Helen didn't respond. Then Roland did something I didn't see coming. He stood up again, held his glass up, not for a toast this time, but like he was calling a meeting to order, and said, and if I may, I would love to discuss something with the family, about the future of this beautiful home. My chest went cold. He was doing it, right here, in front of 50 people, at Greta's 70th birthday. Faye's hand shot under the table and grabbed my knee. Roland put on his most caring voice. I have been thinking about how to keep this property in the family. Helen and I would happily take over the maintenance, the taxes, all of it, for the children's sake, his children. I have already spoken with someone about the property records. With the right paperwork, we could make this smooth for everyone. He was talking about property records at her birthday, to her face. I started to stand. Faye's hand came up to my shoulder and pressed down. Wait, she whispered. Your grandmother is not done. So I sat back down, heart pounding, because what if Greta was too gracious and let it go to keep the peace? For about 30 seconds, the longest of my life, the distant relatives at the far end started nodding along, because Roland's version sounded clean and simple, and people want the nice version. Then, without standing, without changing her expression even slightly, Greta reached under her chair and set a small envelope on the table. She raised one hand, palm up, and the entire table went silent. 50 people. Not a fork moved. Roland, she said, calm as still water. I want to thank you for your interest in this house, but before we decide discuss the future, everyone should understand the past. She put on the reading glasses that hung at her neck and held up the first page. It was Roland's first email, and she read it word for word, the line where he called me Helen's son from her previous marriage. And then, 2 sentences later, called Ben and Cora your true grandchildren. She lowered the page and looked out over the top of her glasses. A slow breath moved down the whole table like a wave. That is taken out of context, Roland said, fast and smooth. I was just trying to explain the family structure to someone who had never met us. Greta nodded the way a teacher nods at a wrong answer she's going to let finish, then picked up the second page and read it in the same even voice, which made it hit 10 times harder. The boy has no real claim to anything on the dire side. The house should be preserved for the biological children of the current marriage. My hands shook against my legs. It was one thing to hear Faye say it on a dark porch, another to hear it read under the lights in front of 50 people who knew my father. Roland did not crumble. He turned to Helen. Tell them I was only thinking of our children's future. Tell them I have been a good husband. Tell them what I have done for this family. He was forcing her to choose, publicly. Helen's mouth opened and closed. Nothing came out. Roland took her silence and used it. He put his arm around her shoulders, claiming, and said, my wife and I are a team. Whatever I wrote for us, for our family. He was wrapping the ugly words in a love story in real time, and a few of the distant relatives started to nod again. Faye stood halfway out of her chair, ready to fight, and Greta raised one hand, palm down, and waved her back into her seat. For a moment, it really looked like Roland was going to charm his way through the truth the same way he had charmed his way through the last 6 years. And then Ben spoke. My 5-year-old half-brother, who'd been holding my arm with both hands the whole time, looked up at Roland and said, in that small, clear voice that cuts through everything because it has no agenda, Daddy, you said on the plane that he is not real family. Why did you say that? The table went dead silent. Roland's arm slid off Helen's shoulder like someone cut the strings holding it up. His face went blank. Ben, buddy, that is not what I meant. Ben didn't stop. He didn't know there were rules about what you pretend you didn't hear. You said business class is for real family. I heard you. He paused, then added, Cora cried. 2 words, and every single person at that table turned to look at Roland. A 5-year-old had done what no printed email could. Greta placed her hand flat on the table and looked at me, and I understood it was my turn coming. She stood up slowly, using the table's edge, unhurried, like the moment had been waiting for her. Roland, I read every email you sent me, every single one. I never responded because I wanted to see what kind of man you would be when you arrived at my table. She held up the pages where everyone could see them. In these you call my grandson the boy. You say he has no claim to his father's family. You ask about this house like it is a piece of furniture you can move into your living room. She set the pages down neatly. This house was built by my husband. My son Larison put his hands on every wall. He was 17 when he laid the floor in the room where you slept last night, Roland. The boy you tried to erase learned to walk in that house. He ate his first meal at this table. He is not Helen's son from a previous marriage. She turned and looked at me, her eyes bright and fierce. He is my grandson. He is a dyer. The yard was so quiet I could hear the bugs in the garden. Roland reached for his last tool and made his voice crack. Greta, I only wanted Ben and Cora to have roots here. I wanted them to know their grandmother. Is that so wrong? The room wavered. I could feel 2 or 3 people at the far end tilt toward him, his best performance at its peak. It was almost enough, almost. But Greta was not done. She reached into the envelope and pulled out one more page from 3 weeks ago, put her glasses back on, and read it in the same quiet voice. Once I have met her in person and established myself, I plan to consult a lawyer about the property transfer. Helen does not need to be involved in the details. She paused, looked at Roland, then read the last line. The boy will not contest it. He does not have the spine. She took off her glasses. The room did not gasp. It went completely still, the kind of still where 50 people are all thinking the same thing, and nobody needs to say it. Roland's face drained of color all at once, like someone pulled a plug. The wet eyes and the cracking voice all fell away, and what was left was a man being seen clearly for the first time. Helen covered her mouth with both hands. I stood up. I did not yell. I spoke the way my father spoke, quiet and clear, the kind of voice that doesn't need volume because the words do the work. Roland, you gave me an economy ticket and told me business class was for real family. You walked into my grandmother's house and tried to take it. You told her I didn't have the spine to stop you. I looked at Ben and Cora. These 2 are my brother and my sister. I do not need a ticket class to prove that, and I do not need your permission to be a dyer. Ben reached up and wrapped his small fingers around mine, and then Cora, 3 years old, climbed out of her chair, walked across the grass, and wrapped both her arms around my leg, pressing her face against my knee. Roland watched his own son reach for me, watched his own daughter hold on to me, watched the 2 people he had used as bargaining chips choose someone else, on their own, in front of 50 people. The last piece of whatever he'd been building just fell apart. Greta let the moment sit, then walked the full length of the table and stopped in front of him, a foot shorter than him, 70 years old, and the biggest person in the yard. You are welcome to stay the night for the children's sake, she said, but this house belongs to my grandson. It always has. Something in her face softened, not for Roland, but for herself. I signed the papers last week. She walked back and placed her hand on my shoulder, the first solid thing I'd touched in 6 years. Roland looked at the relatives who wouldn't meet his eyes, then at Helen. Are you coming? His voice was flat, empty, a man who already knows the answer. Helen looked at me, at Ben's hand in mine, at Cora, at Greta's hand on my shoulder. Very quietly, she said, I think I am going to stay for the rest of the weekend. Roland stood there one more second, then he turned and walked out through the side gate, around the house, and gone. The latch clicked shut, small and final. Nobody followed him. I deleted his number before the cake was cut and never wondered which class he flew home in.